Hello, and welcome to this first of my sessions with you as part of Vision 2020. My name is Seán Goan, and I'm going to be sharing with you 6 inputs on our theme, my theme, which is Jesus as the servant of God in the Gospel of Matthew. And I'd like to just outline, before we get any further, what the shape of the 6 talks is. It'll give you an idea of what you might expect and where we are going as the talks progress. So my hope in this session is to offer you introductory remarks on the culture and the context of Matthew's Gospel, especially bearing in mind that our intention during this summer school is to reflect on Vision 2020, faith into the future. We're thinking about faith in the 21st century and how we might live an authentic Christian faith in our time. But if we're going to do that, we're aware that culture and context are very important in our time and, of course, in the time of the Gospels. And I want to just put that in context in this first presentation. Then we'll move on. Session 2 will take pay particular attention to the shape of Matthew's Gospel and the dominant themes, so we get an overview before we start looking at the particular texts and what the particular texts tell us about the person of Jesus, because that really is the focus of my talks. I want to look at the person of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, and in particular the idea of Jesus as the servant of God. That's a scriptural idea. So in session 2, that's what we'll do. Then session 3, I look at Jesus and the kingdom, which of course he proclaims in the gospel. He proclaims it in word. So we'll consider there the importance, especially of some key texts in the Sermon on the Mount. Then in the next session, we'll consider Jesus and the kingdom in terms of his deeds. How did Jesus' actions, the things he actually did, how did those things reflect his own belief system, his own faith in the kingdom? So we look at especially his signs and miracles and how they speak of God. Then in the 5th session, we look at the fact that Jesus didn't simply come to announce something, he came to gather. He came to gather disciples to initiate a community of faith that would take on board his teaching on the kingdom and would live out of it. So we want to consider Jesus and his kingdom community, the notion of discipleship. And then in the last one, I want just to focus in particular on this idea of Jesus as the servant and how that can be an inspiration for modern living of Christian faith. So that's the shape of things to come, and I hope we'll adhere to the plan. Tonight, or today, sorry, just by way of a broad context, it's worth just pausing to take a moment to think about our own faith context. We're living now, 2020, we're living in a very different world, a world that has changed dramatically in a relatively short period of time. But the language we use to describe our situation then also helps to create the situation that we're living in. We can use vocabulary that is positive, we can use vocabulary that is negative, and that then in turn shapes our view. But it's worth just reminding ourselves of something that Pope Francis said a couple of years ago when speaking to the Italian bishops. He pointed out to them, he said, we are living not so much in an era of change as in a change of era. And I think he was pointing to something very, very important for us there as people of faith. There are certain times when change is so momentous that it's going to have lasting impact. And we're certainly in an era like that. And that's been our experience in Ireland. You can name various parts of or various aspects of that change. One of the dominant ones that impacts on faith is the growth of secularism. And while that could be argued secularism has been around for quite a while, its impact in Ireland has really only been felt in the last, let's say, 30 years very strongly. And even more, you could say, in the last 10 years, we have moved from being what would be called a Catholic country, certainly in the Republic, to being secular. Yes, in many respects. Some would argue post-Christian. And that happened very quickly. And that has been difficult for many Christians, Catholics, people of faith to deal with, find themselves on the outside rather than being at the center, as we were for a very long time. And of course, there are, I suppose, pluses and minuses in relation to secularism, but certainly it's our context, and that's what we have to live with. Another feature of the world we live in now is technology. And I don't have to go into this, but technological change has been vast. Even what we're doing now with this approach to the summer school is evidence of technological change. And we find ourselves using technology that we couldn't have even imagined a relatively short period of time ago. And that's changing the world that we live in. It changes the way we communicate. It's changing the way we do business. And technology itself is changing very, very rapidly and impacting on human life across the globe. And another feature of that, of course, is social media, communicating with one another through means that, well, sometimes people would say cheapen communication, conversation, cheapen or make light of what before would have been required for meaningful conversation. Now you can get away with the tweet. Now we have Snapchat, we have Facebook, we have short messages, we have so many different ways of just putting things out, and it's instant. Some people lament the fact that now there's little deliberation and reflection. That is certainly an issue. It's certainly an issue for the world of faith, but also for the world of relationships and the way society works and functions. And another huge element of our current context is climate change. We are in the grip of a process that is potentially disastrous for our planet. We have been warned about it. It has been pointed out to us by scientists for generations. The church has come on board through Pope Francis, especially in Laudato Si, making it very clear that this is a matter of great concern to people of faith. What we're doing to the planet, our attitude to the planet, how we live in it, how we share it, how we exploit the resources, and how people suffer because of that exploitation of resources, the culture of waste and the culture of consumerism and materialism, and major feature of our faith context. And in the immediate context of tonight, or this course, the pandemic. COVID-19 was something we'd never heard of just a few months ago, and now it has dominated not just our lives, but the whole planet. Many, many thousands of people have died. People have found themselves in situations that they would never have imagined. And it's making us ask lots of questions about lots of things, including the way we are church, and how we will be into the future, how we live as society. So those are all important elements of our faith context for today. Of course, when we speak the language of faith, for many people, there are so many different perspectives that are brought to bear. So when you ask people, do they believe, or what is their approach to faith, you find that there are different worldviews. For some people, faith is all about the search for meaning, looking for meaning in life, and religion and faith in God addresses that, our deepest desire for a sense of meaning. For people perhaps of an older generation, or certainly what many of us grew up with, there was two things at work in a faith worldview very often. One was the fear of eternal damnation, and undoubtedly for very many people, this view dominated their religious sensibilities. The fear that when we die, we are judged by God, and that we could be damned for all eternity for lack of adherence to what was revealed to us. And so many people remember the decades of hellfire preaching and an approach to Christianity that said it was all about avoiding damnation. The other side of that coin, of course, the more positive side, it would have to be said, people's desire for eternal salvation. That the gospel was preached so that people would know the possibility of getting to heaven, what Jesus had done to make that possible for us. So again, the focus though is on the next life very strongly for many people when it comes to faith. That's for people of a certain generation though, and that too has changed in our time. Others, when it comes to discussing faith, focus on the question of sin and evil. The question of what's wrong with the world, what's wrong with human beings, why we do terrible things to each other, why there's so much evil inflicted on innocent people in the world. Why do we do things that are wrong and knowingly do things that are wrong? What do we do with our sorrow then for our sin? Where do we go with that? Is there a possibility of mercy and forgiveness? Is there a possibility to overcome and confront evil? It's a faith question. And allied to that, of course, is how we cope with suffering. Can our faith speak to us about suffering? Can it help us respond to suffering? And another dimension worth talking about is the awareness of the transcendent, that whole aspect of our human experience where we find ourselves sometimes just in awe of what it is to be a human being. And it can be brought on by something as simple as holding a newborn child. The mystery of our existence. Something as wonderful as looking at a sunset over the sea, over in the west of Ireland, and look at a beautiful scene of the sun going down over Donegal Bay, or to look at the night sky and just be filled with wonder at what is, to look at wildlife, flowers, plants, and be amazed at life, to be amazed at what science is telling us about the intricacy of life and the balance of nature, the wonder of it all. And all of that leads people to think about, well, there must be something greater than us. And that's part of our language of faith. Faith then is, let's summarize it with this, we can describe it as a human response to the mystery of our existence. And throughout history, people have sought to give expression to their experience of life and death, to this mystery of our existence. And probably the first time people drew on caves, hunting scenes, a consciousness of life, and maybe struggle, but also meaning and hope and a future. So throughout human history, throughout the history of Homo sapiens, these expressions emerged in so many different contexts and cultures. And of course, they were inevitably and necessarily couched in the language of their time. So all the faith searches, all the language of faith and religion, going back to the ancient empires of Sumeria or Assyria or Babylon, Egypt, and indeed Israel, they all had religious contexts. They all had a religious culture, and they expressed themselves in that language and in the time, in ways that were valid for their time. So, as Christians, we have to acknowledge Christianity also emerged. It emerged in a time and a place. It emerged from first century Judaism, and it emerged in response to the person of Jesus of Nazareth, whose followers proclaimed him their crucified and risen Messiah. That language for them made sense in a context. It made sense in the context of their Jewish belief system. And the language that they used for this proclamation was the language of their time, their culture, and their religious context. When they were talking about this, they weren't thinking about Ireland in 2020. They were thinking about Palestine. They were thinking about Greece, maybe Rome, in the decades of the first century. And that's a very different world. So we now, at this time in our Christian history, we must seek to understand their language and see, can we interpret it for our time? See a line of continuity that links us to their faith in Jesus Christ, crucified and risen. The world of the New Testament, I'll just say briefly here, it's the Greco-Roman world. The context is the Roman Empire, and it emerged out of a short public ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. We forget that his ministry, public ministry, at its longest was 3 years, maybe only a year and a half, depending how we read the Gospels. And he was crucified by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. But his followers proclaimed him risen. And that message transformed them, and they brought that message to the cities and the regions, provinces of the Roman Empire. And so within 20 to 30 years, you had small Christian communities associated mostly with synagogues and Jewish communities around the Roman Empire. But within a short period of time also, non-Jews were attracted to this figure. Non-Jews were attaching themselves to these Jewish Christian communities, and indeed were being welcomed in some cases, and they were being baptized. That decision was made in the so-called Council of Jerusalem by the year 50. So you have the beginning of Gentile involvement in this, what had been a Jewish movement. With the martyrdom of Peter and Paul during the period of Nero's rule, Nero's tyrannical, despotic rule, we had a major crisis for the church, its first persecution, albeit localized in Rome. But something else followed soon after that was also going to shape the world in which the New Testament arose, and that was the Jewish War. The Jewish War was a Jewish rebellion against Roman rule that began in 66 AD. That rebellion lasted 4 years and was ruthlessly put down finally by Titus in the year 70, when the city of Jerusalem was completely destroyed and its temple was destroyed. That meant the end of Judaism as it had been known, certainly for in the time of Jesus. It meant the end of the temple, so the end of priesthood. It meant the end of apocalyptic groupings like the Essenes down at Qumran. One group survived out of that, and that was the rabbis. The rabbis who represented the Pharisee tradition. They became the dominant force of Judaism. At the same time as that's going on, then, we have in Christian circles the emergence of Gospels, written texts for the Christian communities to have them share their faith in Jesus and who they believed he was. So the Gospels arise at a time after several decades of the preaching of the good news of the kingdom. There's several decades of Christian communities growing, several decades of learning to fit into cultures that were not just Jewish, but also Greco-Roman. Into that world, the gospel emerges. Mark was first, generally agreed, and was used by both Matthew and Luke. So that's a really important part of context for us when we consider the Gospels. They arose in a time and a place that was very particular. And if we would understand them properly, we need to bear that in mind. So, in the case of Matthew, for example, the question that's asked is, who speaks for Judaism? Because the Gospel of Matthew is very much concerned with Jewish Christian community, a Jewish Christian community, people who have not completely been inserted into a Gentile world at all. They're very aware and proud of their Jewish heritage and roots. And they find themselves sometime in the 80s, maybe 70s, 80s, find themselves at odds. The Jewish war has finished. The temple has been destroyed. The rabbis are now those who are deciding the future of Judaism and the synagogue. And in that tradition, they focus entirely on the Torah, the Jewish law, and its interpretation. They believe they are the authentic interpreters of the Jewish tradition. And over against them, you have the early church. These believers coming out of a Jewish background who are asserting that Jesus crucified and risen is the awaited Messiah, the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, the fulfillment of the hopes of the people of Israel. Now, as Christianity has spread, that view takes on different expressions. So we have Paul, we'll be familiar with Paul's take on it, and especially through Paul, the spread of the message among non-Jews, the Gentile population. However, in Matthew's case, it seems clear that his gospel was addressed to a community of what we might call Messianic Jews. In other words, Jews who are asserting very strongly their faith that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. And such an assertion puts them completely at odds with their parent religion. It puts them at odds with the Jewish community. And indeed, in the period that we're talking about, around in the 80s, a decision is made through the rabbis and the rabbinic movement to make a break. And they decide that anyone who asserts that Jesus is the Messiah can no longer belong to the synagogue. They are excommunicated. That's a time of great trial for Jewish Christians. And that's the world that Matthew is addressing. Who is this Matthew? Well, the lovely painting there is Caravaggio's depiction of Matthew receiving inspiration as he sits, or indeed kneels there almost urgently, writing his gospel, feeling the compulsion to put pen to paper to express his faith. What might we say about Matthew from the gospel? And I'm just saying it from the text of the gospel. Well, scholars would say Matthew is a Jewish scribe, someone who's expert in Torah, who has become a Christian. So Jewish background, but now embracing faith in Christ. Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. He is well versed in the Jewish tradition, but of course has completely allowed his understanding of that tradition to be transformed by his resurrection faith, the faith that Jesus not only was crucified, but rose from the dead. And with that, was seen to be the fulfillment of Jewish hopes, all the Jewish messianic hopes. God has indeed acted. And Matthew shows that right from the beginning, especially in his infancy narrative, how he describes the birth of Jesus, completely roots the story in the Jewish tradition and Jewish expectation. But what did Matthew do? Well, he had a gospel in front of him. He had Mark, and he used 90% of it. He also, though, had other sources. He used a document that's sometimes called Q, from the German Quelle, that both he and Luke used, material that sayings of Jesus, not found in Mark, that Matthew and Luke both used. But then he also had other material, which they call M, meaning Matthew, sources that were his own, sources maybe belonging to his church, and maybe material that he composed himself. But Matthew used all that material to do what Mark had done. He composes a life, a bios is the Greek word, a life of Jesus, a biography. But he did this according to classical norms of biography. Bios, in the classical world, well, a life in the classical world is not the same as a modern biography, where it focuses on a detailed and comprehensive presentation of the subject, maybe with strong psychological profile or real attention to historical detail. That wasn't the primary concern in the ancient world. Readers in the ancient world expected a story that would give a narrative account of the career and contribution of someone really important, a notable figure, and it would go from their birth to their death, and it would include anything, signs that depicted or suggested that this person would indeed be great. We see examples of them in the ancient world: Alexander the Great, Caesar Augustus, and even in the Jewish world, they had biographies of Moses that followed a certain pattern. This is what we see to some extent in the Gospels. So in the ancient world, an audience would expect a bios, as it's called, to present the person's life and teaching as an inspiration. You know, that people reading it could draw inspiration, that this person could be a model for their own living and their own choices. It would also be important to help a community of people who were gathered around this figure, who were inspired by this figure, who would legitimate their values, their practices, and it also helped to discredit those who were opposed to them. And it would shape and guide the audience's way of life. That was all to be expected as part of the function of the biography. When you think about what Matthew wrote, and indeed Mark, you could see how those things are true for the way they treated the story of Jesus. Who was Matthew writing for? Writing for a minority community, a Jewish Christian community, very possibly in Antioch in Syria. Now, Antioch in Syria was the third largest city of the Roman Empire at the time, a culturally very diverse city, but we do know that it had a very large Jewish population. And we know from the Acts of the Apostles, for example, how important that Christian community was, and how the term Christian, actually, we're told in the Acts, emerged first in Antioch. This community, now in the years in the 80s, finds itself separated from the synagogue, from their parent religion. As part of the fallout from the Jewish war, they find themselves on the edge because they're proclaiming Jesus risen, proclaiming him as the fulfillment of the scripture. So they need to find their place. They're on the margins now. They're margins of Judaism, but they're not fully inserted into the Gentile world either. So they are in a difficult place. They're in a place where having faith in Jesus makes great demands on them. It's putting them in, if you like, in a spot, and they're having to make serious choices. So this community on the margins, both in relation to the empire, because they don't really belong there, and in relation to the synagogue. That's the context from Matthew's gospel and why he writes. So finally then, just slide a little bit on the person of Matthew. What we have here on the slide is Rembrandt's depiction of Matthew. I like it very much, I must say. I like that old man. Now, it's a close-up there of his face. Behind him there's someone whispering in his ear. If you could see the whole picture, you see that that's an angel doing a bit of whispering, inspiring. But what I see in Matthew here is a man deep in thought. He's wondering, he's contemplating, he's thinking, how am I going to write this? Now, I know traditionally Matthew of the evangelist is associated with Matthew the apostle. That association began with Irenaeus, really, towards the second half of the 2nd century. But the gospel and the form of the gospel, the shape of the gospel, everything about the gospel suggests that it's not Matthew the apostle. Firstly, why would Matthew the apostle use as a source for his gospel the work of Mark? Matthew the apostle would have been an eyewitness. Why would he rely on an account that wasn't from an eyewitness? So that's the first thing. Secondly, Matthew the apostle was a tax collector. He would not have been fully imbued and steeped in the Jewish scribal tradition the way this author clearly was. So some people see that perhaps in Matthew chapter 13, verse 52, we have a little signature. We have Matthew writing himself into the story after Jesus has shared the parables with the crowds. He inserts at the end of the chapter, Jesus says, "Every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." And there we have Matthew, the scribe, doing just that. Matthew, steeped in his own Jewish tradition, finding himself in a world that he couldn't have imagined, a world where he's having to make choices. He's having to understand the consequences of accepting that Jesus is indeed the fulfillment of Jewish hopes. So there's a link between us and Matthew in this sense. Like us, Matthew is a human being. He's in a time and in a place trying to answer a question. Who is Jesus, and what does it mean for me to believe in him? And we can draw great inspiration from his gospel. And hopefully that's what we'll be able to do over the next 5 talks. Thank you for being with me this evening.